Okay.
No, it's screen.
Sorry, Hilan, I'm trying to remove my video background.
Your freshman is. Your freshman.
There.
Hold on. Let's see. Let's see if the sound is the sound good.
Chris says it's good.
Okay.
Paul says good.
All right. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for all this. It was great. It was marvelous for me. It's been an honor to hear all of you, to be with you, and all the rest of it. Have much to thank. You created this network of discussion that obviously makes the book worth publishing. So thanks, first of all. So I'm going to read my replies that I've been working on in the last few days to some of you. Unfortunately, I won't be able to do it for all of you for various reasons, including time constraints. But I hope, somehow I will address at least part of the issues that we've been discussing in the last 3 days, one way or another. So I'll start with my response to Shaviro. To engage in a general account of how things are is to risk paradox. Totality, with its different figures, including the impersonal one that enables a symmetrical view from nowhere of anything, is looming about, and it could make everything available to an exercise of unconstrained, unsituated freedom to review. Yet, this is the game of philosophy. And in this sense, it is a language, and in some related sense, it is a literary genre in which fictioning is possible. Franz Rosenzweig, for what can be considered to be good Levinasian reasons, would refrain from it, would refrain from doing philosophy, and recommend that distance is kept from it. Totalities would make anything personal impersonal and renders anyone's life into sameness, as everything is as equally part of a global picture. Levinas would still insist in going to the dangerous zone with Aristotle's Protrepticus brought in by Livingstone. If you should do philosophy, you should do philosophy. If you should not do philosophy, then you should do philosophy. He would insist that one can speak of what one cannot speak, going against both the seventh session of Wittgenstein Tractatus and the Derrida's injunction against the possibility of saying what Levinas himself wanted to say in philosophy. As Shaviro writes, both of them are wrong. You cannot remain silent, whereof you cannot speak, or whereof you cannot speak Greek, the language of philosophy. Levinas would rather force the language of the unspoken, bring in the foreign accent and sketch it even at the cost of paradox. As a foreign to the land who feels the urge to speak up what cannot be spoken, and in a way that is not unlike fictioning, more than what gets said, a contradiction. What matters is the very saying of the paradox, contradire, that saying and said, yeah, that is that one is obliged to dwell in contradictions in order to say what is urgent and impossible. The root of paradox in Levinas is home ground. It is stated in the beginning of Totality and Infinity that the aim is to bring Rosenzweig's criticism of philosophy inside philosophy. This is the stated aim of the project, and its main formulation is the paradox of freedom. Through my freedom, I discover my responsibility, and then I am no longer free. Philosophy is a domain of freedom. Nothing apart from my own impossibilities would stop me from getting anywhere. There is no passivity, and receptivity itself could be taken as a strategic passivity where I listen to something in order to gain better access to what was previously concealed. Yet, it is the exercise of this freedom that I encounter. It is in the exercise of this freedom that I encounter responsibility, something that cannot either come independently from my freedom because it is exercised within it, or come as a consequence of a free deliberation. Responsibilities are there from the beginning, like what lies before any grounds, but cannot come to the fore, but in the milieu provided by freedom. As a consequence, when I'm engaging in a philosophical endeavor of providing a general account of how things are, say Indexicalism, I am in the very milieu where the responsibilities will become apparent. When they become, my engagement with philosophy and its crave for totality will fade away and criticism of metaphysics will replace what previously was just an exercise in metaphysics. But criticism emerges from freedom, and therefore I cannot renounce doing what I cannot do without the act of engaging in the paradox. The extent of the infinite responsibilities lying in my own personal situated position reveals something about how things are through the exercise of freedom, and that is of seeking the general account. To use a Tractarian image again, one could throw the ladder away, but at the cost of not being able to reach the top again. In other words, what matters is not what is achieved, which is paradox, but actually the saying of the contradiction, contredire, reaching there in order to appreciate the situatedness that one is tied to, even when trying to climb up the ladder to see it all. The paradox doesn't dissolve after it is stated, before it is said repeatedly in different ways. Compare with fictioning, and one doesn't find a domain where contradiction lies. Contradiction is what I end up saying when I try to engage philosophy with the others that compel me, where I engage philosophically with the others that compel me. My freedom leads me to my situatedness, not because I'm free to be situated or not, but because it was from the very metaphysical desire for others that it emerges. This is the Indexicalist picture. This is a picture that is faithful to Levinas's gesture, even though it is perhaps not what he had recommended. It is, in the lovely, the Regent phrase of Shaviro, a Levinasianism without reserve. Indexicalism, with the help of Whitehead, perspectivism, and externalist account of Indexicals and other ideas, extends the gesture beyond the limits of the anthropic. In fact, as Shaviro says, I claim that there could be no principled way to distinguish what can contest me and what can merely refuse my attempts at fruition, to use a dichotomy that appears mostly in Totality and Infinity. To say Indexicalism extends Levinas, or that it performs a broken, interrupted speculative flight, taking Levinas as a takeoff lane, is one way of putting it, which I sometimes indulge. But perhaps the very idea of Levinasianism without reserve is that the gesture cannot be restricted to the anthropic it cannot be restricted to the entropic. If the restriction applies, two things follow. First, the entropic becomes a kind of a realm of paradox and contradiction. Is bound to be to the philosophy that encounters human. It is only towards the human and human other that I have incumbencies, and therefore the paradox merges when my general view concern them. Second, I have to bear in mind that the other I'm facing is human, and that makes me engage with a neutral space of general and consistent contact between me and the other. The neutral is a figure of the symmetry that Levinas rightly abhors, for it replaces my encounter with the other with a two-lane image that can be quickly reviewed from nowhere. The first point circumscribes the domain where the paradox inside, and we can end up simply with an entropic dialetheia. The second point is made by Livingstone after Derrida and his contribution, and his brilliant. It recalls Butler's remark on giving account of oneself, but I think it's better than that. Part of the gesture of Butler is captured by the idea that the human is neutral, and neutrality is a step towards symmetry. We can say that all humans are my incumbencies, and as I am a human, the paradox the paradox not only comes too quickly, but also it's circumvented, and the rest of the world towards which fruition supposedly takes place is immune from it. So the rest of the world is for pure fruition. And then you have like maybe not one, but even two neutral elements coming in the picture. Indexicalism applies notions such as proximity and substitution, recurrence, obsession to any other, and posits that they gear towards the outside that is always around in perception. Shaviro has this great image of ophthalmological proximity to claim that proximity is not only an anarchic, but also disturbing, overwhelming, and often anathema to communication. He then finds it inappropriate, the perception taken as hospitality, and built from the indexicalist paradoxical and situated metaphysics is compared to a conversation. His reasons are clear. A conversation seems to be too much of a mutually cooperative, somehow symmetrical, maybe neutral, communicative and consensual endeavor. In proximity, one feels often the weirdness, the eeriness, and the hostility which the incumbencies could meet. Conversations are perhaps too hospitable and too converging to be part of what Levinas had in mind when he thought of obsession for the other or the wound that makes me vulnerable. Even among humans, a conversation can be impossible. As Lafayette points out, the other could be too impaired, fragile, or hurted to be part of a conversation. In any case, incumbency doesn't disappear when the conversation fails. Proximity, Shaviro points out, involves sometimes suffocating compulsion, and complicity could be thoroughly unwanted. I agree with all that. At this point, I could recoil from my appeal to conversations in the book. Surely, I would rephrase some of the intensity I placed in them. I would not fully recoil only because I believe that there is more to conversations than conversations. In other words, when two people stop talking to each other, or a wounded animal becomes too ferocious to be dealt in closeness, there is still responsibility, obsession, and capacity to respond. A newly acquired foe can become unable to talk to me, or me unable to carry on exchanging words, but still I continue to respond. I do it because the intricate interplay of demands, urges, and substitution wouldn't just fade away, as proximity is not easily exorcised. That interplay could be called an extended conversation. And this is perhaps still a good way to describe some features of perception. In this case, even while renouncing to speak of what cannot be spoken, a response could possibly be given. That fictioning is possible when philosophy fails or becomes too paradoxical is perhaps also a move in a broad, open, and ongoing conversation that would involve, for instance, go doing some philosophy, go doing some fictioning, because the incumbencies come before. And I think this is the qualification that I think I have to make. I mean, that I think there is a limit to the seriousness, to the intensity that you should uh, um, see in conversation. Uh, right. Moving on. Response to Gevorkian and Segovia, who are actually in front of me right now. So thank both in particular very much for hosting me these days over here. Without offering not even a glimpse into how to best interpret or translate an Anaximander sentence, I find interesting to go back to that conjunction of injustice and the course of things. On the face of it, it could sound like something about the vertiginous notion of what deserves and what doesn't. One would in fact feel like there is a reason to engage with general questions concerning how things are, because that could be a way to determine what is deserved and what is not. In the more common philosophical and general reading of Anaximander, the urge for justice is seen as spread everywhere, and to find answers about it, one needs to go into the arrangements between what comes into being and what perishes. Now, it is not said there that there is an order to all that. If there is, it can be intrinsically opaque. Further, it can be an order that is eroded and reshaped at each new event, and nothing is safe from deviation, from interruption, and from non-monodic addition. Still, the issue of injustice and merit persists because it involves a quest that cannot be dealt with once and for all. It is a foray of any kind into the way of things. If a foray of any kind into the way of things is prompted by Anaximander's tie between the process of things and justice, it can find out that the others encountered are never transparent from the point of view attained, and yet they are inextricable from the issues raised by the quest for justice. If we agree that an Anaximander sentence provides a guiding map for what philosophy becomes from Ionia, from what philosophy became from Ionia to Iena, we can see already the roots of the Indexicalist paradox. There is a project for this foray that aims at surveying what there is in fact a variety of projects to this effect, and they become somehow dominant, and even though hardly consensual. If this survey intends to make everything transparent, it could discover that justice lies in the opacity of the other. Further, it may discover that the opacity and situatedness ought to be a constitutive ingredient of what there is, if justice is not part of it altogether. Indexicalism and the metaphysics of the others is faithful to Anaximander's sentence in the sense that it is a way of reading it. Likewise, it is a reading of physis cryptestai philae. Indexicalism holds, nevertheless, that this faithfulness to Anaximander is a guiding is not to be found everywhere. In particular, it is not to be found in an approach that can be called, to use Levinas's phrase, ontologism, the claim that only being is real. That approach, which is at odds with Plato's sophists, 5 great types, including 4 indexical ones beside being, makes hardly any room for justice or injustice, merit, deserving, whatever could be taken to appear as a main character in the plot of an Anaximander sentence. Ontologism is perhaps the shortest path to accomplish the goal of a neutral, impersonal account of how things are. And in that sense, it is committed to substantivism, the image of the world where positions and axes play no role. According to the metaphysics of the others, that takes otherness seriously as the axis, justice can only be made through situations, especially because its demands cannot be replaced by substantive descriptions once and for all. One way or another, and in different instances, in the long road from Ionia to Jena and beyond, the last part of an Anaximander sentence was downplayed or straightforwardly dismissed in the name of a robust ontology of substantives and often of substances. This gesture had a great impact on how we displaced incumbencies from freedom, concerns from facts, and justice from knowledge. It is also why philosophy can often seem like the realm of the impersonal, of the non-situated, of the indifferent. Expurgating the last part of an Anaximander sentence paved the way for this special dispensation that the quest for finding things out and make use of what is found to entertain responsibilities. Kevorkian and Segovia place Indexicalism, the book, between the subtractive and chiastic logical architecture. For them, I think it moves away from an operatic style towards something that could be found, I believe, in the sentence of Anaximander. This integration within a split enables an opening towards transversality. Attending to 2 poles is not a commitment to symmetry, but rather an acceptance of imbalance. In bringing a concern with the other as an order to a landscape familiar to process philosophy, the book intended indeed to bring forth a kind of agenda that would be oblivious to any separation between metaphysical concerns and how we deal with what is around that would dangerously leave proximity, responsibility, and care out of the picture. If there is a separation, and it is perhaps a paradoxical one, it is one that is often reinstituted, for it is not a no trespassing fence. To think through the chiasm in which philosophy has to be placed in order to take the other seriously is a way to stretch a vocabulary and begin to move away from a language of universality. And if I understand them well, the chiasm is what ensures contradiction to be preferred to indifference. Response to Coburn. If dialetheia are understood as places where the paradox lies, or even as parts of reality where contradiction entails no quod libet, no triviality, then the issue appears as to whether they are substantive or indexical dialetheia. One can arguably aim to fix contradictions once they cannot be eliminated to a restricted zone with marked borders where there is a domain on which contradictions are true. To be sure, as Levinas himself shows time and again, and I said above, we cannot afford not to venture into these paradoxical areas, and if we do so, we can at most try to walk carefully. But perhaps dialetheia are not substantive, but rather an indexical effect, as Livingstone argues in his paper. It is the essential indexical that leads to most, if not all, paradoxes. If V is a suitable domain for a logic of demonstratives, closure entails transcendence, and if we grant existence, we can either deny closure and assume what Coburn calls the Bova-Livingstone line according to which there is a tension between consistent plurality and inconsistent totality. Indexicalism goes for the latter. In fact, it is through exploring closure that one finds transcendence. And as I said before, that is, closure is the very fact that Indexicalism with Levinas ventures into a philosophy. And once transcendence is found, the metaphysical endeavor that affirms closure is criticized. The closure ladder can be then thrown away again, but only at the cost of not reaching the place where closure can be criticized through transcendence. It seems, at first sight at least, that, that if there is above a Livingstone dialetheia, it is dactic and depends on a context added to the character of the demonstrative. It is a situated paradox. In other words, contredire. In other words, it is through looking for symmetrical relations around that around what one finds as symmetrical positions that inform a situated metaphysics of the other. One can project this asymmetry in V, but in doing so, one engages in the paradoxical, impossible, and perhaps urgent task of formulating, transcending closure. We can think further about indexical dialetheas. From the perspective of deictic absolutes, there ought to be an outside of what there is. That outside is part of what there is. This outside is therefore inside what there is and outside it. For each tentative class of what there is an outside that is both outside and inside. That contradiction follows from an indexical position of what is outside a given class. For each closure, there is a corresponding transcendence and therefore a corresponding dialetheia. Livingstone's argument that most of or any paradox have an essential indexical kernel to it would then perhaps entail the dialetheia are themselves indexical items. It is only from the point of view of a class that there is an outside, like it is only through pointing that this sentence while stating that it is false that the paradox arises. True contradictions are an effect of having indexicals like this or outside, just like paradox is an effect of having an indexical general account of how things are. Coburn points at an interesting epistemological occurrence of the closure transcendence tension. I'm tempted to skip this paragraph altogether because it deals with stuff that we ended up not discussing so much in the symposium. It deals with the way I see the Davidson McDowell discussion. So I'll skip it. Maybe read just the end. The outside in perception is both part of the landscape that makes perception possible within a deictic operation, therefore into closure, and what transcends perception, and therefore transcends what has been conceptualized. This is reminiscent of Levinas's version of the ontological argument. The exterior imposes itself as such from within. So that's an interesting comparison he makes. It's like it works like the ontological argument. It's kind of the ontological argument for exteriority. It imposes itself from within. That is, in the language of the book, from an interiority. It is at the same time a position in the deictic space with which I orient myself and something outside of it. This is why the other as great kind in Plato's Sophist is the subterraneous dynamics of any negation. I'll come back to this. But I mean, on the face of it, it's just It's just the idea that nothingness, yeah, in the sophist appears as what is other than being. Therefore, it's from other and being that you get nothingness. I have recently proposed that we can see the encounter with the other, as Levinas conceives it, explicitly as something that precedes any attempt to extract the intelligibility of what surrounds us. This is in a paper called Anake Sheinos Urihia, the primordial order in a cosmopolitical forest. It's in Cosmos and History this year. There is an often unnoticed starting point, which is something else before me, facing my sensibilia, even before my sensibilia is engaged in its activity to perceive and know anything. I compare this prehistory with Heidegger's second beginning, which is prior to the first. The first being that of Sein, written in the normal way, equals physis. And the second of Sein with a Y equals Ereignis. Here, it is not Ereignis that precedes physis without grounding it, but it is the very encounter with the other that precedes without grounding any attempt to extract information from the other being met. Perception is encountering with an outside before it triggers a knowledge process. As such, it is haunted by an incumbency and a transcendence that limits the exercise of my spontaneity irrespective to my cognitive capacities or deficiencies. Response to Livingstone. Indexicalism inherits from Levinas both the taste for adventure that guides moving from an arguably safer criticism of philosophy to the attempt to be in the midst, in its midst, and the rejection of the idea that an attachment to neutrality is recommended in order to prevent the sliding into paradox. That makes it go into philosophy preferring paradox to neutrality. This rejection of neutrality guides the way totality, or the absence of it, is then taught true. It is as if we could say, as the whole, reality is such that there is no whole. This is where the language of paradox and that of fictioning meet, as Shaviro points out. Livingstone argues that there is no paradoxical metaphysics, and one should rather adopt a critical position towards the project of a complete description of things that would engage indexicalism as an item in its toolbox, like one among many tools to criticize metaphysics. This project, which is arguably part of the indexicalist project as I see it, one could be tempted to take an impossible measurement and say it's as half of the project, is in a sense an effective follow-up from Rosenzweig's abstention from philosophy. Such abstention is taken in Levinas' bag when he ventures into philosophy. So he takes the abstention to philosophize in his bag when he ventures into it, into philosophy. As I began to explore in my response to Shaviro, there is a neutrality element here, nonetheless, that is interesting to notice, it seems to me. In a sense, to refrain from paradox is a way neither to take sides concerning the two conflicting poles, nor to bet in Polemus itself. The first option is also a way is always a sure way to avoid paradoxes, and in this case would amount to either embrace philosophy in its tendencies towards the neutral, the impersonal, and the non-situated image of things, or to reject it altogether. To be sure, criticism could take these two flavors or mix them, perhaps paradoxically, to refrain from taking sides by saying that this is a dangerous area, or to take side with the thorough rejection of the philosophical endeavor as a commitment to a general view of things, like a skeptical view. Interestingly, there is an indexicalist paradox looming in the horizon for those who adopt the critical view. Reject both sides and dismiss the side of philosophy in an emphatic way. I conjecture that this is a way to find a reverse paradox in a position which refrains from stretching indexicalism into a general account while rejecting general accounts in general for indexicalist reasons. The reverse paradox would nonetheless be committed to neutrality. Indexicalism is a tool for criticism, but it cannot go beyond that without tainting the ultimately desirable and perhaps unattainable attachment of the philosophical endeavor to neutrality, or vocation to neutrality. Now, Livingstone not only understands the gist of the indexicalist endeavor with its paradoxical consequences, but also expands it in interesting ways. In particular, he explores the idea that dexis is the root of paradox. I don't quite know how far can we go in this indexical analysis of paradox, but Livingstone suggests that notions such as outside and inside are crucial for the very statement of most paradoxes. Further, one can explore the possibility that set theoretical approaches, once we realize there is maybe indexical paradox with the set of all sets, ought to be approached from a deictic point of view. This is something I cannot but begin to think, but here, but it is, but it makes, if it makes any sense, that would provide me a way to generalize the account of proposition I am developing somewhere else to encompass at least some mathematical propositions. At any rate, the idea of a border can be viewed as potentially invoking indexicality. Tristan Garcia has crafted the notion of de-determination that picks up a thing from a realm of objects and predicates and provides a universe in which the thing's borders are the crucial ingredient, the line between that thing and all the rest. The procedure, as I write in the book, is similar to that of reference fixing. The borders emerge from the determination and individuate something with respect to them. While these borders are established, one can prove to be wrong about any substantive description of the thing without losing the counter that specify it. It would be interesting to explore how much we can make explicit the dexis behind set theoretical paradoxes with the help of the idea of determination in its indexical resonance. Livingstone, if I understand him rightly, recommends modern realism as a companion to indexicalism. I would resist that. I've already mentioned that to Paul, so I'll go through it. Not because I dislike Lewis's attitude considering actuality indexical. What makes this word actual is that we are in it, but rather because ultimately his concretism about possible worlds end up being not indexical enough. I maintain that reference fixing is a procedure that targets what can be accessed from my actual position through an explicit indexical, through a proper name, or even through a description, as Kripke and Donnellan have shown. The price for Lewis's concretism and modern realism is to take every world as substantively different from each other. Maybe we can say that indexicalism comes too late when then you want to say that the actual world is actual because that's chosen by opposition. As a consequence, I'm a bit lost here. Anyways, words are deemed independent from each other and their denizens are never identical. To be sure, this could work out as a way out of the seemingly difficult problem of transworld identity. But I think Kripke is right in rejecting this Leibnizian path of having each possible world with its own and unique denizens. It is crucial for monadology to work, but this is one of the ways to see how indexicalism departs from monadology. On Kripke's take, I am me in every possible world, which are accessed through the actual world where I am. And are not to be thought of as foreign countries or distances you can observe from a telescope. It is from an actual referent in the actual world that other worlds are drawn, and accordingly, the transworld identity problem doesn't arise. The center is always, or maybe it does, but I mean, this is something that we can discuss. But I think if it arises in a different way. The center is always in the actual world, which is indexically chosen. To be sure, the path from I in W to in one world to I in another world can be different from that from I in the second world to I in the first world. But this is where indexicalism leads you to know all-encompassing totality with a view from nowhere. All the other possible worlds are others. And again, I am not the other world's other. It seems to me that this is the way to avoid a balanced reciprocity and ultimately descriptivist, substantivist account of the denizens in different worlds. I have something to the effect of indexicalism rejecting the Phrygian notion of Gedanke, but yeah. A response to Lafeta.
Just
Do
before
the
you
others
begin,
have an
Hilan,
interiority? Lafeta's question opens the way to a paradox she identifies at the kernel of the Indexicalist project and can be a way to summarize its paradoxical metaphysics. The answer is indeed ambiguous. To a first related question, do I get to know the other's interiority? The answer is no. While to a second related question, is there more than one interiority? The answer is yes. Maybe we can say that the others have interiorities, but they are not fully present to me. The different interiorities are in
okay, so it seems like we've lost Hilan for the time being. Surely he'll reconnect
I've
shortly.
unmuted it, and I've opened already the. Yeah.
Carlos, if he's there with you, perhaps he could use that computer.
Yeah,
Okay, now I see him. There he
I'll
goes.
carry on as Carlos because my Zoom just crashed. I don't know why, but I think transmission is still going. Okay. So the answer is indeed ambiguous. To a first related question, do I get to know the other's interiority? The answer is no. To a second related question, is there more than one interiority? The answer is yes. Maybe we can say that the others have interiorities, but they are not fully present to me. The different interiorities are in a diachrony that makes them accessible to me in general only through the perhaps fictioning effort of philosophy. Yet philosophy cannot make a substantive predication about the other's interiority, and neither can encountering the others render interiority transparent. The other is a continual exteriority leaving traces on me. Meeting the other leaves me not only interrupted, but also in perplexity. I make myself, right, okay. So I'm going to go back to my gallery view. It's a bit. I can make myself fully available and yet not know how to respond. Not know how to respond to for the exteriority of the other, for the exteriority of the other, pierces through what there is in my interiority and suffocates me. It is not quite that I can give what is in me, rather that I should provide something I cannot own for the other. This is what happens in the perceptual event. What is perceived is not non-conceptualizable, but rather it forces me out of any existing conceptual scheme. It perceives through my conceptual capacities and presses me away from my interior space. This pressure is there even if I am also pushed for reasons of justice with other perceived others to make it fit at least partially into a concept. While I can have an account of perception while engaged in philosophy, that it takes place in a situation akin to that of hospitality, for example, each event of perception turns me between the conceptual scheme that results from the imperfect attempt to do justice to what has been perceived, an attempt always urgent and impossible, and an interiority that does not make itself often or open to me. I believe this can be done only if the account of perception satisfies Tsing's injunction of leaving space in the ground for something that eludes the narrative provided by the account. This is why the dynamics of hospitality, which is always haunted by hostility, can illuminate my encounter with the others in perception.
And we're now past the hour,
we are
Hilan.
now at the hour. So I still have some to go. In fact, I had a response to Harmon, as you can see, then a couple of others, Prosperi Caron, Johns, Moninska, to you, Chris, and then to Andrea Vidal. I don't know. What should we do?
It would seem to me that perhaps if you want to condense the responses and continue on a little while longer, that could facilitate discussion, or you could also focus on those that are here, since ostensibly they'll be the people that will be engaging in the discussion next. What do you think of those options?
Yeah, well, that's good. So I've got you, JP, and Andrea. Sorry, I don't have a response. I have Yanin as well. I don't have a response for Ahab, even though I do mention his stuff in a response to Graham. But this is something that I think I'll skip. Maybe I'll just very briefly comment. I don't have a response for you, Jason, as well. Sorry. So basically, I think what I'm going to do is, so that we can discuss a bit, is to very briefly talk about these responses and maybe read bits of it and try to do all this in 10 to 15 minutes at most. Let's see if I can. So, what I do in my response to Harmon is, I basically try to respond to his misgivings about my problems with OOO. I also try to explain my position with respect to relativism, and saying that there is no relativism neither in Amerindian perspectivism nor in Latour's position. In fact, Indexicalism and Amerindian perspectivism can be seen as a strong realism, a realism about things like Indexicals or the other. In my response to, I'll skip my response to Herman, which is about the idea that the Levinasian subject doesn't doesn't actually learn anything from the other. And I think it's an interesting point, but I think there is a response to it. Then I'll move to response to you, JP. So I think I'm going to read. That's because otherwise I won't do justice to it, I think. Yeah? I don't know. A bit tired at this point. There seems to be a tension between indexicals and abstraction. In fact, indexicals are situated and dependent on acts akin to pointing, indicating, tracking, and or locating. On the other hand, abstraction is often considered to be tied to universality. Universal indexicalism deals in paradox, and this is a bullet worth biting, as I argued. But I'm not that sure that abstraction is committed to universality. Neither am I sure that indexicalism runs into paradox by accepting any kind of abstraction. Similarly, I wouldn't claim that abstraction is to be avoided from the point of view of metaphysics of the others. There are, to be sure, many kinds of abstractions, and not all of them simply obliterate exteriority. We are familiar not only with concrete universals, but also with abstract particulars. Tropes, as they are sometimes called, are resolutely particular and could be a challenge to existing concepts. Nor are abstraction necessarily at the service of, say, extracting the intelligibility of things. I believe that a relevant doses of abstraction is required to depart from the metaphysical project or to any of its variations. So I think I'm saying that basically to get to the point that criticizing, for instance, the road from metaphysics to the artificialization of the world involves as well a lot of abstraction in a general sense. Caron points at indexicalism, points at how indexicalism offers a ground to the post-nihilist Marxism that I'm trying to develop. And today he said that I have suggested this to him. So, I mean, whatever. Yeah, I thought this was something that he got from his own mind. But anyways, the idea is the idea of post-nihilist Marxism is to combine thorough trust in the release of new productive forces as a way to challenge existing human and non-human social relations with a rejection of any attempt to replace things, object, process, events, by their suitable artificial counterparts. That is accepting the transformative power of production, or poiesis perhaps, while resisting the turn of the world into Gestalt. I agree indexicalism can ground this development that is perhaps best thought as being situated once the forces of production has different impacts on how things are in different circumscriptions, especially if the reterritorializing drives of capital itself are set aside. Caron then proceeds to criticize post-nihilist Marxism as an impossible combination of what I defined elsewhere as the anastrophic and the catastrophic cosmopolitical tendencies of the present. The former tendencies see the present as ushering in an interesting future, while the latter see it merely as a movement where what has been commendable in the past collapses. If I understand it right, Caron's misgivings with post-nihilist Marxism hinges on the idea that we can either accept or reject abstractions altogether. Now, as I see it, post-nihilist Marxism is not only a direct consequence of indexicalism, but rather an attention, to addition that leads also to what I have developing as an anti-monotonic, non-Taskian logic of the supplement. The power of addition is what makes the changing forces of production capable to unsettle social relations. Further, it contrasts with the artificialization of the world, not only because there is no substantive intelligibility to be extracted, but also because the very introduction of machines change the salient features of the landscape. Techne is not a replacement, but a supplement to physis. Though thought can be then disconnected to homoiosis and rather considered also to be also in terms of supplement. To think is to add something and to respond to what has been added. This, however, goes a little bit beyond the scope of indexicalism. There's a response to John's that kind of developed this a little bit further, but I'll move directly to the response to Janina, response to Maninska. The book offers an account, Indexicalism offers an account of perception in line with the metaphysics of the others. It doesn't offer, however, a conception of memory. Memory is not a place of transparency. This is why the past haunts us, and dealing with others involves a persistent diachronia. Perception appears in the book as an arena through which it is possible to escape from oneself. The same should be said about memory, because it is an always fail attempt to control what is coming back as remembrances. The haunting of the past responds to a requirement of justice that involves all generalization. And this leads us back to Anaximander's sentence. It is in this path that indexicalism, as I realized lately, meets the spectrology that has been developed by Argentinian philosopher Fabian Ludueña, somehow inspired by the efforts of Derrida and Spectres of Marx. Calls from responsibility come not only from what I perceive, but also from what was left unresolved, either in my previous perceptions or in the commitments of groups I belong. When Spinoza has this recurring dream with the image of a Brazilian black leper he once pictured in his head, he's haunted by the outside. As the infinite demands for justice in perception, unsolicited remembrances have claims on us. Now, very quickly, I think I'm going to say something about Chris and about Andrea, who are, I think, here. After saying something, Chris, about which I think is welcomes your comparison with Panikar's ideas, and I think, yeah, welcomed his attempt to give me a roadmap concerning the relevant issues. In fact, theological relevant issues. In fact, Panikar's Advaita seems to adhere to the idea that the fine-grained structure of positions dissolve the idea of a substantive interiority. It is not inside substantives, but rather in the outside that any tie with any other can emerge. It is through the address where the other appears that the separation enables exteriority to thrive. As Levinas had emphasized, my complete communion with God would make my capacity to be commanded disappear, for a complete integration means an absence of the other, and therefore of any exterior pressure over me. Without atheism, there is no religion, Levinas claims. And similarly, without a separation from the other that ensures there is no interdependence, there is no room for the other to be a transcendent other. And then there is a sentence that I don't quite understand in your text. You say, Panikar broaches another facet of the other that remains unmentioned in Bensusan. Yes, the other claims, captivates, captures, and obliges us. But it is not possible that the other might also love us with a rebounding love that belongs to the ultimate nature of the whole. Now, if by this he means that the other cannot be expected to love us with the rebounding love that characterizes the whole, Panikar's theology is certainly close to indexicalism. If, on the other hand, if by this he's claiming that this love can be expected from something that is not the other, and referring to a source associated with the whole, then the claim diverges from indexicalism. In any case, in the fruitful fiction with Panikar, as Ray Alexander presents, the issue of conversation is brought up again. As emerges with Shaviro's remarks, indexicalism contact with the exterior is not based on symmetry or reciprocity-oriented resolutions. It is unbalanced, lopsided. Reciprocity is perhaps not a requisite for an extended conversation that would involve not only silence, but eventually suffocating aggression and explicit offense. But if it is, the ways may part, especially if that means that imbalance is always limited, constrained, or bound. If it is so, an account in terms of substantive is looming. In any case, theology could be a good way to think through an asymmetry that resists at least some forms of reciprocity, for it is in an irreducible imbalance that the transcendence of the others lie. Now, very quickly, for Andrea. Basically, I don't say anything. Hello. I don't think I say anything that I didn't say in the session itself. So basically, I insist that ontological pluralism is not enough. You ought to have something like an ontology with a space for other accounts. That is, ontological pluralism per se doesn't meet the what they call the Tsing injunction. I believe this is my point. Vidal thinks of ontological pluralism in connection to her own encounter with the circumscription of Cerro Rico. It is there that she hears from those who attend to the mountain that it will collapse. Indexicalism is a gesture towards a successor metaphysics that is not oblivious to what emerges when this mountain, with a past that perhaps haunts various regions of Western thought, is in proximity. Coburn finishes his text saying that we will be known by the mountain. I guess this means that through silver, a lot of the rest of the world has been brought to its proximity. Multiple accounts of the mountain, perhaps including narratives forged in its proximity, are welcome, but the successor metaphysics that indexicalism intends to promote would urge for an entanglement between them that makes sure that blind spots are counted within each of them. Narrating, as much as philosophizing and writing books, is an exercise in incompleteness. So thank you very much for your patience again. And I don't know, so now I think we can have a discussion. I'm sure I didn't respond to everything, as I didn't respond to everyone, but anyways, I hope to be able to do it in a more thorough way in the written version.
So should we proceed directly then to questions, Hilan, or anyone who would like to offer their rejoinder or commentary?
Yeah, I think questions, yeah.
Who'd like to start us off?
Well, we began with our own presentation, and maybe it's a good moment to continue with this conversation. Very briefly, I think you've made, in our case, an impressive and beautiful response, which is extremely thought-provoking, which gives us a lot of things to think. I think that it's beautiful that you've engaged with Anaximander, and I do think that you really provide a very insightful interpretation of Anaximander's saying. So, well, it just leaves us thinking. And I think that you've understood perfectly. And it was a difficult and important nuance, I think. The question about totality and chiasmus, and reciprocity, and it's again fantastic. So I'm not going to formulate any questions. I don't know if Sophia will want to formulate any, but I would just simply like to thank you immensely for your generosity in the way in which you have addressed what we have put forward during our presentation, and it's fantastic. We take these just as an opportunity to continue this conversation further. So well, that's all on our part, I think. Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. And I mean, to everyone else, it's been really a great experience, and these have been lovely days of thinking and discussing. So we're very happy and grateful to have had the opportunity of being with all of you. So well, that's it.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me from here like this?
Yes, very well.
You keep it like this. You keep your.
I keep it like this. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, John Bova writes something. I don't know if you want to expand on what you just wrote, John, or otherwise I can read it.
Yeah, these are really just marginalia. They don't need to be focused on.
I have a quick question. I mean, I'm not sure what's happening here, because there was a session in Spanish and Portuguese, as far as I can recall, and the responses here were all in English. I'm curious as to what's happening here, and also I feel like I missed something. And as a person that was there, Hilan, for you, was it any different? Any sort of like, because of the languages, was it a different sort of like approach to the book or something? Any insight? I'm really curious.
Yeah, well, thanks. There's an echo. Thanks, Aha. That's interesting. Well, basically, I think we had a very interesting session there. I think we had like 4 very nice contributions. The discussion was very good. I sort of decided, I kind of bet that Gabriela wasn't going to be here, and then she can read the text. If she was going to be here, then I would translate to her. I thought Andrea and Herman and Zara could be here, but then they wouldn't have any problem understanding English. So I thought, for the benefit of everyone, it would be better to have a reply to them in English. Also, it is an idea. The other reason is to give you all an idea of what kind of things we discussed in this session. So that was the rationale. In fact, I think, in a sense, you asked whether the discussion was different. I think the discussion was more, with Gabriela, was more intensely on Levinas, as this is what basically she's been doing since she was a kid. So, I mean, it was more intensely on that. With Andrea, it was around the coda. So we had a more thorough discussion of the coda of the book. And Herman placed a very interesting argument against Levinas that comes from Damien Celsi, and we discussed that, and whether this applies to indexicalism. So yeah, so that was my decision. I mean, it wouldn't make much sense right now to reply to people in different languages. I'm very tempted to read. I'm very tempted to read what John Bova is writing.
Well, and
out loud.
I would love to hear.
Concentrate.
I would love to hear from directly, and also, in as much as I can venture a comment, I would like to capitalize on what he's mentioned with regard to the Kenu Upanishad. So, if I can be forgiven, I would do that, and then invite him to respond. So, this notion of transcendence, in some sense, being inevitably collapsing within absolute idealism. And as much as that's like a fitting description of Shankaracharya's philosophy, I would suggest that there's actually maybe something more we could also say there, in as much as if we take the what Panikar calls the Advaitic intuition to lie, or at least give rise to the notion, the equation that Atman is Brahman, or that in some sense the transcendental soul and a transcendental God perhaps are one and the same. I would argue that this is not equivalent to saying that that I am the transcendental, but rather I is the transcendental, so that the transcendentality of the situation from which I speak as I is what in fact I discover, and so that the conditions that apply, in as much as there are indexicalist conditions, would also apply to God's self. And I think that the result of this, then, you asked if how this love might be described that I mentioned, and to whom it might be applicable. I would invoke the same kind of Upanishad and say that part of loving or wondering as to the status of the love of a God for us, of the other for us, would be a realization that love is always found in the lover refusing to make their love into the beloved, so that you have a love that is only ever confirmed in a loving responsiveness to the other, which in some sense not only doesn't anticipate the reciprocation of that response, but realizes that a grasping of that response would be impossible, and that itself is the condition of love. And I think what we get then is something like the infinite responsiveness that we find in both in Levinas and in like Francois Rafoul's account of ethical responsiveness in Heidegger, which is certainly the angle that I would like to take there. I don't know if John would like to push back on that, or someone else would like to offer a comment as well.
So you think that there is no replacement for this, for what the others cannot offer?
I think the fact that there can be no replacement is in some sense the very condition for my action. In alignment with what I said in my paper earlier, or in response to your comments, I think that the condition of failure is in some sense what we have to assume as any condition of responsibility, in the same way that we find this paradox where I only encounter my freedom by way of also encountering my responsibility towards the other, such that the two are concomitant. So I would say that in the sense in which the beloved can never be properly loved is the only condition of my loving, and yet it's in that loving that I not only love, but become in some sense synchronized with loving itself, which again, to refer to it as the beloved is already to fail. Did you want to push back on that, John? I saw that you entered in.
No, not at all. I don't want to push back against anything you said. It reminds me slightly more of Kashmir Shaivism than it does of Vedanta, but I'm largely out of my depths there. I chatted to Chris that I was going to use in the paper exactly the text from the Ken Upanishad that he picked out about you cannot see the seer of seeing, et cetera, et cetera. It goes through this in with regard to all of the senses and the intellect in the usual ascending way, because that seems like the ultimate expression of essential indexicality to go up against in that tradition, and it's certainly what has to be contested in Madhyamaka, well, even in the Abhidharma. But I also found this text. It's in the Upadesha Sahasri, which I think is by far the most fascinating of Shankara's texts, in which you've got another indexical metaphor that's actually quite complicated to work out, I think, but definitely relies on indexicality. I'll just read it. Atman, abiding in the intellect, is seen as if it were moving and meditating when the intellect moves and meditates. The mistake about transmigratory experience is like that of a man in a moving boat who thinks that it is the trees along the shore which are moving. Just as to a man in the boat, the trees appear to move in a direction opposite to his movement, so does Atman appear to transmigrate, since the Shruti reads, and then we quote the Upanishads in a relatively opaque way. And I love that what this immediately reminded me of is all of the late medieval and early modern texts about dudes in boats that lead up to Galilean relativity, and also that you might have expected the analogy to play out in quite a different way. You might have expected the illusion to be directly that the man in the boat is moving relative to the apparently objective things on the shore. But that's not how the analogy works. It's kind of fascinating.
Well, incidentally, that gives me something to say about what you were saying, John, earlier. Basically, and something that JP was saying as well, or something to do with what JP was saying. Basically, I mean, in a situation like this, basically, not only you have that perspective, yeah, but also Indexicalism affords you to have also the idea that there are another perspective, yeah, and this can be thematized, and this can be explored to the sense of saying that, for instance, from the perspective of the river, say, what is moving and what is not moving is different. So you can sort of thematize these things, and this is something that is interesting here, because basically perspectives themselves, they can be, I believe, substantive or indexical. So the idea that perspectives are indexical is a further move. So basically, when the distinction between the dichotomy between substantives and indexicals wouldn't apply only to substances, nor only to substances and relations, or substance and relations and state of affairs. I think everything is prey of substantivism. And here again, I think I can say something about abstraction. I think Indexicalism involves a lot of abstraction. For instance, just to play within the logic of demonstratives. That's a lot of abstraction, if you want to put it this way. So, for instance, as I was saying yesterday, and said again before at some point, basically you want to replace what is substantive, but what is by what is indexical. But that doesn't mean that you're going to remove, say, the logical apparatus that would allow you to think conditionally and all the rest of it. Yeah, I think as a program that I think I can put in close to what to the way John Bova was representing today, as a program of desubstantivizing through making explicit the implicit indexicality. That applies to all sorts of things. So yes, I think I'll leave it at there. But coming to this,
yeah, but
I don't know if
I
you're
think
happy
for me,
with what
I mean,
said
sorry.
about post-nihilist Marxism. But basically, I think a great part of this is not indexicalism, but also the idea that we're coping with addition. And one of the things I say in my response to John's is interesting because, in a sense, he has this very absolutely opposite conception of exteriority, because his project is to do an object-oriented dialectics. So he basically has a Hegelian notion of exteriority. And what I find interesting is that the idea that exteriority is
is produced is not completely alien to indexicalism for reasons that you can imagine, yeah? Because the notion, the connection with the other, but the other has to be there, and the other has to be somehow inside my kind of deictic circumscription. So therefore, it is produced by deictic operations. So in a sense, the idea that exteriority is produced in the Hegelian version of things can be somehow accommodated or approximated. And I was thinking, basically, when we are in a very different country, like this country of speculative realism, if that makes any sense, and then a Levinasian approach meets a Hegelian approach, then maybe there is something to be learned about the microstructure of exteriority. This is one of the things I say to Charlie. The other thing I say to Charlie is that I kind of believe that addition, and this is what connects to post-nihilist Marxism. I believe that addition is somehow more prior than negation. And the reason why I believe that is that in a paper we published, I think, last year, it is shown that we can get paraconsistency through anti-monotonicity. Anti-monotonicity is one way of dealing with the logic of supplement. It's maybe not the only strategy, but it's an initial strategy. So basically, with anti-monotonicity, you have a set of premises. If you add any premise, then you're going to lose conclusion, right? So it's a non-Taskian logic. It's a very, very sort of divergent logic. And a logic like this that we call a minimal logic is paraconsistent. So in a sense, that gives me the idea that maybe negation, paradox, and contradiction are not on the basis of everything, but addition is rather what is responsible for consequences like that. But anyways, this is just to clarify what is in my response.
Yeah, regarding just to quickly respond, like I think my issue, it's part of it, of course, is a kind of incomprehension. Sorry, my cat is going crazy. Part of it is maybe partial incomprehension, because at the same time I see kind of two different justifications for indexicalism. One of them stems from the adoption of a linguistic framework that is based basically on indexicals. And the other one is the argument from interiority, exteriority. I'm not sure they go that well together, because, for instance, what I call the bypassing strategy is the fact that you could completely ignore the content of your, it's not really ignore, but you can individuate through a falsity, okay? Some entity or through some indexical act, so to speak. At the same time, when you talk about interiority versus exteriority, it seems it's not really indexicality in terms of reference fixing, but in terms of ostension, because that to which is your surroundings you can point to. So there is, for me, in my reading at least, a kind of difficulty deciding if you are talking about indexicality in terms of a logic of indexicals that not necessarily has anything to do with surroundings and ostension and this kind of thing, which lends itself more to the idea of, for instance, knowledge by acquaintance that was raised even by Paul Livingston in his presentation. I was kind of caught between these two interpretations. Like, one is more epistemic, like a certain kind of familiarity and respect to the otherness that appears. It is there in your surroundings. This is an epistemic issue. While the other is a logic of indexicals that I don't know, can pick an entity from any possible world, which has obviously nothing to do with this kind of acquaintance in empirical terms. So I was trying to disambiguate between what was it really about through the appeal to your previous text that I was already discussing. Like in a certain sense, it seemed to me that you wanted to restrict universality in terms of maybe not abstraction is not maybe the best word, but a kind of universality in terms of what you say like is an extraction of intelligibility. So in a certain sense, others would say like a subsumption or something like that. But I think its extraction is quite interesting because at the same time, for instance, in my example, my practical example of the practical abstraction is not subsumption really. It's the fact that there is a property at stake that gets individuated by the operational scheme. And then retroactively, you can make explicit what kind of property is being played with and to do certain operations with this property. So I am, of course, I could show my full colors here. I'm a kind of a Stellars and Brandomian person. So I would say that, I like what you say, like you're putting, I know you have like this strange relationship to Brandon, like you're saying like in terms of making explicit the implicit indexicality, this kind of thing. But for Brandon, you see, you can a PV, a pragmatic meta vocabulary for indexicals can be a non-indexical vocabulary. You see. So it's of course the semantic of indexicals is non-reducible, semantically irreducible to non-indexical vocabulary, but the pragmatics can be defined in non-indexical vocabulary. So in a certain sense, I would think that in order to bootstrap oneself out of, for instance, commodity abstraction, this kind of thing, that is kind of a hyper species of, a super operational scheme that, comes up with a universal equivalence of sorts, you would have to deal with an ecosystem of different linguistic practices. And my gut feeling is that indexical vocabulary wouldn't cut it. And indexical vocabulary seems to me like a kind of restrictive measure in order for those kinds of abstraction not to even emerge or something like that. But it's too late. Like what I said, like about you have to either uphold abstraction in capital or in nihilism or not. It's not really that. It's the fact that historically certain operations come about. I mean, that is a Zono-Heterian thesis, right? We can of course not accept it, but I mean those processes are enmeshed one with the other in a certain sense. So it's a kind of the tragedy of capital is that the fact that many resources, also thinking resources, were made possible historically by these kind of forms. So what we do with that? So of course, my take is completely different from yours. For me, it seems that indexicalism is a kind of restrictive kind of logic. Maybe I'm mistaken. I have to look more into it because I was also, as I said, caught between these two interpretations. One more empirical interpretation of ostension, and another that is trans-world identification, reference fixing, and this kind of thing, which are very, very, very different, has very, very different consequences, which has to do with the fact that indexicality is not locality. So, I mean, if you were talking about locality, you can have like locality in non-indexical terms, like for instance, Badiou. You can have a Heyting algebra and, index, as John said, index something. Everybody in the world has like a transcendental degree, you see. So something like that, and it is localized, but it's not indexical. You don't do it by putting yourself inside it. No, it's localized, though not indexical, you see. And from that point of view, indexicality, on the contrary, seems like a non-localized strategy because you can have trans-world identification, whereas in localization, no, you are not in the world, but you are describing it as in non-indexical terms, you see, even though you localize everything you talk about. You can localize it in your Hutting algebras, in your formalism, in that sense. So sorry, I'm not sure if I'm being clear, because this is, of course, I'm still processing the book and all of that. So yeah, so just making explicit what was the kind of things that were in my mind regarding all of that.
Well, thanks a lot for this. Yeah, I think that's good for me to understand your paper a bit more. I was going to say, I like, for instance, the way Chris starts his paper by comparing Indexicalism with Bodenstandlichkeit in Heidegger, because I think in a sense is a departure from the idea of rootness, of blood and soil, as Levinas would put in his 1934 book about the philosophy of Hitlerism. He'd say Hitlerism is about blood and soil, and it's a very interesting diagnosis. So it's a departure from that. And in a sense, what Indexicalism tries to do, in a sense, in line with Levinas to a great extent, is to provide a different kere or a different sprung, depending on where is your Heidegger. Yeah. So basically, a different kere in the sense, a different turn, right, from the metaphysical, path. So how do you turn from it? Instead of applying, I say this in my response to Harman, because he tries to separate out, philosophical or kind of metaphysical questions from political questions. And I think this is more complicated than that, because basically, on the one hand, you have like this business of a kere, which is crucial if you understand the road Heidegger is trying to draw for thinking. But then Indexicalism would be a different kere, not a Heideggerian scheme, but a very different one that is not based, Sophia, on being, but it's actually based on the other. It's based on like meeting the other. What is to meet the other? Now, but I mean, there is something that can be drawn from Heidegger to some extent, and this has to do with cosmopolitics and this kind of thing. Basically, Heidegger says, I cannot just impose the kere of my own, because if I do that, let's put it this way, it's as if like I knew how the world functions, and in a sense I'll be still trapped in metaphysics. Or to give a slightly different account, I would just exercise, or an indexicalist Levinasian account, I would just be exercising my freedom and nothing else. But I cannot just wait and see, wait for the kere to come, because I am involved in the kere. So it's a very difficult political stance to take, but it's definitely something that has to go in this direction. So yes, I think Indexicalism is proposed as a way out of the Gestaltization of everything, if that is an expression. But to respond to you more directly, basically, how the two things come together. I was telling someone, I don't know if in the symposium, maybe not, about the genesis of the whole idea. At some point, I thought I want to assert a kind of a realism about the other, about the exterior, but at the same time, I want to make sure the other is to some extent thematized. So for instance, you can think of this in terms of fruition versus metaphysical desire in terms of the totality and infinity. So how do you put these two things together? Once, as Shaviro, as Stephen suggested, you cannot just separate out between metaphysical desire for the human order and fruition for all the others. Yeah. So if that is out of the picture, then in a sense, how do you're going to do this division? In a sense, it's not a division in domains. So how are you going to split these two things apart? And then at the beginning, I thought like, oh, maybe I should have like different modes of existences, and that didn't seem to convince me. I thought like, well, it's going to be very complicated to do that. And then finally, I decided to totally embrace a paradoxical metaphysics, which is in line with Levinas's attempt. So, in a sense, what that gives me, it gives me a possibility to be a realist about indexical. So that means, for instance, concerning time, I can be a realist about a series, and at the same time, I can be at the same time I can be a realist about the other. So I think these two, and then of course, once other is an indexical. So basically, the domain of my realism, I thought, ought to be indexicals. I'm not sure I covered everything you said, but basically, the idea is that you can think, well, but demonstratives, indexicals are linguistic expressions. But of course, we got a semantic. And the way I normally think about the semantics of indexicals is through Kaplan, because as I said, basically the idea is that I have my misgivings with Kaplan because he basically goes for direct propositions. However, I think we have a common enemy, which is the Phrygian, I would say Phrygian descriptivism is a very bad way of portraying Frege, what Frege does. But I'm just, with Kripke on this. So at least with the old Kripke, because I think Kripke has learned far more about Kripke since naming about Frege since Naming a Necessity. But yes, so I mean the idea is that to replace this realism, this total realism about substantives that makes indexicals just operational or instrumental, to the other way around. So basically revert this, and basically indexicals are implicitly everywhere. Substantives can help calculation, let's put it this way, can be useful, but I'm not going to give any, so to speak, ontological, I don't like the word ontology in general, we don't give any ontological import to them, which probably leads me to what Andrea wrote in the chat, but I think Paul would say something.
I was going to follow on realism a little bit, but if we want to talk about Andrea's, that's...
No. It's written here, so I can read it afterwards.
Yeah, so I mean, what you just said, I mean, I think actually about, kind of that commitment to realism and to this kind of like what looks at first, to kind of like a mainstream philosophical ethos, maybe as like an inverted realism, a realism about indexicals rather than substantives. But I think that was for me, just to say like that was kind of one of the most powerful gestures of your book and the most, convincing. And then, I think as you just mentioned, and this is something that I think would bear more talking about and thinking about if we had more time, would be to talk about the implications for example, temporal indexicals for, vindicating, for example, A series realism, as opposed to kind of just the standard, move, which is to say, just index the A series and then it's the B series, right? And then we kind of actually lose, you know, we think we're being kind of ontologically hard-headed, but we actually lose realism about tense and change and time and becoming. So all that's just to say, maybe I can say something like a little bit kind of responsive or about the question of modal realism with respect to that, and why I was wanting to push for modal realism, for Lewis's kind of modal realism. I mean, I guess the position would just be that I think you're right with respect to wanting to favor, you know, so certainly you're right, I think, about the generalized critique of descriptivism and those sorts of reasons for going with the kind of more with the kind of Kripkean direct reference or rigidity picture. But I think that's actually kind of neutral between Kripke's, you know, sort of implicit metaphysics of modality, if he has one, and Lewis's. And I think you could go either way. I think Lewis is not doesn't have to be a descriptivist. He can go for rigid designation as much as you want. Both of them are going to have to say something about essentially identity across possibilities or across possible worlds. And you know, and I think the question of that, I mean, so the question for Kripke becomes, if he doesn't want to be concretist about the other possible worlds, just how are we realist about the modal properties, what he would call the modal properties of the individuals, and then he'll talk about, you know, essences or something like approaching that. But I think in one sense it's the same problem, and I don't think we kind of. But on the other hand, there are kind of, it seems to me that there are good kind of reasons which are not external to indexicalism to think that, and you know, this already shows up in Lewis's actualism or Lewis's indexicalism about the actual, to think that that the kind of alternative is not as good. I mean, on the non-concrete alternative, right, you still have these kind of descriptions, or you have some kind of way of accessing the modal properties, which is to say the properties and other possibilities, but they turn out to be less than really real. And this is Lewis's really argument against the kind of linguistic ersatz kind of positions and so forth. So I'm just saying, you know, I think to me, like what I sort of thought was indexicalism could be thoroughgoingly realist in a way that you kind of, I thought you kind of pointed to. And then if we went that way, then we would have to work within a conception that's kind of neutral and paradoxical in the way that Lewis's realism demands that he be. Namely that all the worlds have kind of equal ontological status. We don't have different degrees of being, or you know, something like that, right? So I don't know. That's very vague, but I just to kind of say something about realism and where realism might go about these things.
Yeah, well, the reason. The reason I mentioned Leibniz is not by chance. I think that kind of Leibnizian conception of possible world without transformed identity, that goes with, I don't know, Leibniz's image of a God who contemplated all the possible worlds from nowhere, right? Because God is not situated. This is something that Michel Weber reminded us about Whitehead. Whitehead's misgivings with Leibniz was basically that that Leibniz thought God was an exception, whereas Whitehead wanted God to be an example. But basically, what matters here is that God is from outside, like contemplating everything. So basically, of course, I mean, Lewis is not committed to that, but still committed to the idea that, as a matter of fact, there is a totality there. And this is a complicated issue, but it's a totality that can be seen from absolute nowhere. And of course, I mean, in a sense, I'm always saying that you engage into totality when you start doing the game or the fictioning of philosophy. But in a sense, that's what you not get in Kripke's view, because in Kripke's view, basically, it is from the actual world that you conceive every other possible world. So it is indexical from the beginning. This is one thing. The other thing is I'm not convinced. I mean, I'm sure, for instance, nowadays the way it is portrayed in the literature is that if like two-dimensionalism is compatible with direct reference, but maybe I need to look into a little more. But I mean, my preconception is that they get very close to descriptivism in the end, especially because they reject some of the crucial moves that Kripke does in Naming a Necessity. But yes, that's why I would, side with the direct reference people on that.
So I think we can agree, and this is I'm with you against Lewis here, that
cannot hear you.
Sorry. Now can you hear me?
It's our problem here because we have a complicated system.
Oh, okay. So I'm with you against Lewis, and I think we can agree on this, that if we are realist in that kind of way, then we have to equip ourselves to a view of totality like the God's eye view for Leibniz that will be paradoxical, and then we'll have to sort of demonstrate the implications of that paradoxicality. I would just sort of think that for Leibniz as well, and for Lewis and for Kripke, it has to be the case that we, situated as we are, however we are situated, can think. I mean, even if the individuals are all sort of internal to their worlds for Leibniz and defined only in terms of their own individual worlds, still he has to acknowledge that we in some way can think the other possibilities. And so we have to kind of have this access, or something like this kind of access to the other possibilities. And that's exactly where the problem kind of gets going, I think, right? And when we realize that to have that access is not to have the God's eye perspective, and yet it is a kind of access to the other, that's where I think you can kind of get the paradoxical structure to really do some interesting work. And that's kind of what I was sketching, but very quickly with the talk about centers in there. I mean, the suggestion is like, you can reconcile perspectives with a kind of overview of all the possible worlds through this kind of device of centers. And I kind of wanted to question that. I kind of wanted to say, well, okay, you kind of balk about that. And if we say, I think, as you said this, it was just a sentence in your response, but you said the center is always in this world and is indicated indexically. Well, that's okay, but then there are lots of centers, right? I mean, I'll have my center and you'll have your center, and this moment will be a center, and the next moment will also be a potential center. So we have the problem of putting that all together, and that's where it's going to just be paradoxical, I think.
I'm tempted to actually rework what I said in my response to you, Paul, very briefly, because I think we have a concern with time now. But basically, let me try to do it. Basically, if I understand you correctly, your criticism of paradoxical metaphysics back in your paper has that basically, I mean, the idea is that there is no metaphysics there. You should actually refrain from doing it. And then what I do with this respect, I compare this kind of attitude to the attitude that Rosenzweig had, like, I have, philosophy is about being personal, is about neutralizing, it's about totality. I'm not going to go into that. And I criticize that from outside. Now, thing is, when you take your criticism or your paradoxical critic approach to metaphysics or to philosophy in general, when you do that, or to metaphysics, I'll say, because I think that's the point about against paradoxical metaphysics. When you take this, in a sense, you say, because we are in paradox, this leads to paradox, then we should recoil and move back. And then, if I am right, in a sense, that means I wouldn't move back if there was no paradox, right? Then maybe apart from other reasons, I will have no reason here move back to recoil from metaphysics, and then I'll take sides instead of embracing a paradox, let's put it this way, or I'll just refrain from taking any side as the critic, when the critic becomes the skeptic. This is what I try to say. Whereas the paradoxical metaphysical stance is to actually think that it is the friction itself, and this is indexicalist in a sense, and this is something that is indexicalist and paradoxical metaphysics. The friction itself is constructive. It's like in a sense, if one, as one used to say like a while ago, conflict itself is not only unavoidable but productive. So I think that would be my kind of rebuttal to your criticism, but I'm not sure if that makes sense. So I wanted to hear you say.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I'll just say really quickly, and I want to give other people a chance,
Sorry.
but my position is not, I would want to distinguish my position from a kind of quietism or a kind of skepticism. So in other words, I don't think I'm kind of like just recoiling from philosophy. I think I'm doing something, you know, I'm trying to do something that is still philosophy, but is different from what metaphysics tries to do. And the recoil is kind of, I mean, the way that the paradox leads to that recoil is just to say, from the paradox, we can see that what metaphysics tries to do could never be done, could never be fulfilled, could never be accomplished. And that gives rise to a different kind of use of the paradox, which is, for me, a critical use. But, you know, as to whether that's constructive or whether it's an adventure, I don't know. But I think it's a use, and it's a use that even borders on, I think, what Levinas does call an ethical use. And that's where it becomes ethical political rather than something different. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, I wanted to say something. There is now, I believe, a translation of Andrea's comments. There is an echo.
I don't know why.
I don't know. What should we do?
Sorry, do you want to speak about Andrea's comment first?
Shall we?
Maybe.
Do you want to say? Do you want to say it out loud, Andrea, or read it?
Please.
What I wanted to say, I have awful English, sorry to all of you, but Aja is right. I'm a Spanish speaker, so it limits the discussion. So thank you, Chris, for the translation. And I realized there that I had made a mistake. There was a mistake and something that I was saying. It was a response to the response that Hilan developed earlier, and maybe it's my mistake that I didn't send the paper to read to be able to read it. But what I wanted to say in my presentation, it was not a pluralistic ontological model per se, but it was a requisite. I said it was necessary if, only if, there was a epistemological model to develop in a metaphysical of paradox. That there was another requisite. It was the requisite of methodological pluralism and pluralism of criteria, and of course, a link with the politics of knowledge in a cosmopolitical model or in a political relativism. And Hilan only answered or made a response only seeing the political relativism and the ontological pluralism. And it was not quite exactly what I said. There was no necessity of narrative, englobant narrative And in fact, I do not agree with that. And I think there is incompletion, as said Hilan. I agree with that. It was only, well, if we want to talk about knowledge, if there's an epistemological issue here, well, there are some requisites. Or we are talking about something else, or not talking about knowledge at all, and it's all right. It was only that.
Okay, shall we go towards the end? I think Aha wants to say something, and then I don't know if maybe we have.
Yeah. Some quick. I'll try and be very quick. Okay. First, well, I want to be quick. I'm making here a quick connection, maybe too much of a connection between multiplicity, plurality, and complexity, kind of many. And was thinking there's an example in the text I put actually from Bensusan regarding cybernetics, and he pointed out some paradox that in terms of cybernetic systems, when the switch is on, then the operation is off. When the switch is off, the operation is on. So in a sense, like a thermostat is always paradoxical. However, he also pointed out that from the point of view of the thermostat, it isn't paradoxical because for them there is no logic. It is just oscillations, which again takes us back to complexity. That from a complex point of view, sometimes the paradoxes just disappear. With a smile, I just wanted to finish with, Hilan, thank you very much for kind of joining slowly the frictionistas.
Yeah, it's interesting to think in terms of a double articulation. I think this is one of the models that, because in a sense, paradoxical metaphysics, I think Paul would agree with that, is something that is, that needs to be worked a little bit further. Yeah, I mean, how exactly you deal with paradox. And I think one of the models, I'm sort of, in my mind, I have two models now, and I haven't worked that out. One is double articulation, as I had said, Bensusan and the rest of it. And the other one is the way Fabian Ludueña goes with his disjuntology. I'm not sure I understand what he means, but basically he wants to say that there is no kind of physical closure between two domains, and yet there is an occasional connection that is not continuous. It is rather intermittent between these two domains. So I don't know. I think this is something to be worked on. But anyways, as a thank you note, I would say that I see philosophy. I think it's in my preface somewhere. I see philosophy as an ongoing conversation. Conversation is a word that acquired a bad reputation in this symposium, and very rightly so, I think. But I think it's let's rather say that is a collective, or maybe not so collective, but is a work in progress, anyways. And I mean, a book is just a state of the art in a given moment. Yeah. In fact, Indexicalism is some extent is an old book, because it was ready like by the beginning of the pandemic. So, in a year and a half, it's like I taught many things and I changed my mind in many respects, and I wouldn't write it the way it's written in some ways. But in a sense, for many reasons, I'm reconciled with it, and I'm happy that that is out, and I'm happy with most of it. I think I don't I wouldn't withdraw the main tenets of indexicalism. Bits and pieces. I think there are some very unfortunate formulations here and there, and especially. And this was pointed out by my students first. I have to say, especially this business of siding with their rare propositions, which is really very confusing because you shouldn't be doing that. You should actually to say it in a short way, side not with Kaplan but explicitly with Perry on that. So, but
I understood that as well.
anyways,
I even wrote that down. Like Hilan side with the preposition. This is my text. I understand. I understood exactly that. But if it's not that, I was wrong.
This is unfortunate in the book. That's what I'm saying. There are other places where the formulations could have been better. But anyways, that's the way it is. Yeah, it's about incompleteness, and yeah, that's. But I think by and large, I think it's a book I endorse, I sign, and I'm very happy that it provoked that much discussion, and I hope we carry on talking in different ways about the book and about something about other things and about philosophy. So there is a discussion about chiasmus and Merleau-Ponty in the chat. Also Bateson appears. Anyways, so I'll leave to the chair to close it.
Well, what a fascinating conversation. We always have the excuse of incompleteness for all the feelings that we still have that we wish we had voiced, and the conversations that we wish we had had, and certainly for the second edition, which can only come too soon in some sense. But we will all be eagerly awaiting it, I'm certain. So to everyone who presented, I thank you. To all of the performances that we have been able to enjoy and the performers who enacted them, we also very much appreciate that. And thank you, Hilan, for the invitation. I speak for myself, but surely in the greater Geist of the group assembled here and those who have been spectators online, serving as our inscrutable exterior other. So with that, I suppose we are closing this session and also the symposium, and we do so with great thanks. It has been a privilege to be here.
Okay, so I'll stop